7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. We're starting off today's broadcast in Mexico. Former Mexican Defense Minister General Salvador Cienfuegos Zepeda is charged with allegedly trafficking drugs and laundering money. Zepeda was arrested on October 15th in Los Angeles, California, and has now been charged in California with conspiracy to distribute heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador supported the arrest, telling BBC News that the real issue in Mexico is corruption, and is attempting to overturn legislation in Mexico that protects former government officials from prosecution nationally and internationally. Across the pond, a fourth charge was issued against former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Sarkozy is accused of membership in a criminal conspiracy for allegedly accepting money from Libya to help fund his presidential campaign in 2007. The investigation, which has been ongoing since 2018, also sees him charged with corruption, illegal campaign financing, and benefiting from embezzled public funds. The former president is already scheduled to go on trial in March of 2021 for different charges relating to overspending his 2012 re-election campaign budget, a campaign that was ultimately unsuccessful. He was president from 2007 to 2012. The new charges could lead to a second trial. Germany announced on October 15th that the country would be distributing $662 million in COVID-19 relief money to around 240,000 Holocaust survivors who are struggling during the pandemic. To qualify, the survivors do not need to be located in Germany itself. In fact, most of those receiving funds are living in Israel, North America, Western Europe, and the former USSR. CBS News reports recipients will get 2 payments of $1,400 each over the next 2 years. Moving to South Africa, a senior army official has been shot and killed in Guinea 2 days before one of the most controversial elections in the country's history. Colonel Manami Kande was shot early on the morning of October 16th by armed men in Kindia, according to the West African country's defense minister. The timing of the murder is being called suspicious, given how close it occurred to the election. President Alpha Conde is running for a 3rd term in office, a move critics say violates their constitution, which has a 2-term limit. A new referendum voted on in March approved a new constitution, which the president says resets his 2-year term limit and allows him to run again. Protests of Conde's running for office have been taking place all over the country. 30 people have been killed since the protests began. Just above the Horn of Africa, in the Western Asian country of Yemen, Houthi rebels and the pro-government Saudi Arabian militia swapped prisoners of war in Yemen from October 14th to 16th, the biggest release of prisoners since the war began in 2015. Over the course of the 3-day exchange, around 700 Houthi were released, along with around 400 Saudi Arabians, as well as a few United States citizens and journalists. The International Committee of the Red Cross oversaw the exchange, which was agreed upon last month at a UN-supervised meeting. The war has left over 110,000 people dead, and the BBC reports it as the worst humanitarian disaster in the world right now. 13 bodies were discovered after a landslide in Vietnam. 11 were army personnel, and 2 have yet to be identified as of October 16th. A different landslide in the same area left several people stranded in need of help when the rescue crew discovered the bodies. Vietnam News reports the death were the result of a hill collapsing and swallowing the building the army personnel were inside of. They report 8 people made it out of the tragedy alive. The tropical storms hitting Cambodia are also responsible for these landslides, having already killed 36 people in Vietnam. Farther east, human rights advocates and the LGBT plus communities across Asia are calling for an Lgbt Equality Law in Japan. There is currently no law guaranteeing equal rights for LGBTQ plus individuals in Japan, and while the minority is slowly growing, for many in the East Asian country, it is still considered taboo to be out. Same-sex marriage is still illegal, and transgender individuals are required by law to note their sex change operations in all legal documents. Activists are calling for the law to be enacted before the Olympic Games are set to be hosted in Japan, saying it has the potential to be a, quote, Olympic legacy. And for your heartwarming story of the week, a study in the United Kingdom this month showed that a dog's heart rate skyrockets when they hear their owners say the words, "I love you." Canine Cottages, a dog retreat company in England, conducted a 7-day study, putting their pups through a series of scenarios. Data found showed an average heartbeat of 67 beats per minute. But when the owners say the words, "I love you," hearts soared to 98 beats per minute, just over a 46% increase. And if that doesn't prove that there's no love like a dog's love, we don't know what does. Now, for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic, for the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to the Around the World reporter, Connor Donnelly.
Thank you, Eli. Good evening, everyone. I'm Connor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. Europe is struggling to contain a second wave of the coronavirus as local leaders are pushing back against national authorities. The English city of Manchester, as well as the Spanish city of Madrid, are both challenging new lockdown measures, saying not enough is being done to ensure financial security during a new lockdown. In Germany, several legal challenges are delaying the government's efforts to enforce curfew measures. Meanwhile, in Latin America, many countries are starting to relax lockdown measures as numbers begin to decline. Venezuela will begin offering national flights once again to select countries, while Argentina will resume domestic air travel in the coming weeks. In the Middle East, Iran is experiencing record high numbers, with a single-day death tolls of over 300 people. While the Iranian government has issued a mask mandate, it has not implemented a total lockdown, although schools have once again closed. And in Africa, the country of South Africa has passed 700,000 total cases. Although the total rate of cases has fallen dramatically in the country since July with the imposition of new lockdown policies. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Connor Donnelly. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just tuning in, you're tuned in to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. To conclude our show every week, we're spending time highlighting issues not commonly covered in mainstream media. This week's topic is climate change and its effect on our oceans. In a study published October 14th by the Proceedings of the Royal Scientists Journal, scientists said half of the Great Barrier Reef's corals have died in just the last 25 years. On October 7th, tens of thousands of dead marine animals washed up on a beach in Kamchatka, off the coast of Russia. On October 13th, a second wave of marine life washed up, dead. Upon further inspection, 95% of marine life on the seafloor of Kamchatka has died. Both of these stories are indicators of a changing oceanscape around the world due to climate change. We have two remarkable interviews coming up for you on just that. First, I spoke with Dr. Elena Sakirko from Greenpeace Russia to get a better idea of the situation on Kamchatka and how Greenpeace believes climate change is impacting our oceans. I'm joined this evening by Dr. Elena Sakirko from Greenpeace. Dr. Elena, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate it.
Hi, good evening.
Hi. So first, can you just give us a little bit of information about yourself, your name, your title, and what you do for Greenpeace?
Well, my name is Elena Sakirko, and I work. I'm based in Moscow. Work for Greenpeace Russia, and I'm dealing with climate and energy issues in Greenpeace. And also, I'm the head of energy program in Russia.
Fantastic. And can you explain Greenpeace and its mission for our viewers?
Well, at the moment, Kamchatka and on Kamchatka Peninsula, we have big environmental catastrophe. I can say this already, and our mission, Greenpeace, there is to bear witness to what is happening, to try to get as much evidence as we can to investigate the possible source of this catastrophe, and to highlight, to talk to the media, and also to reveal what is happening there, to try to get to the source.
And as you mentioned, Greenpeace did call the situation on Kamchatka a quote environmental disaster. You agree with this statement?
Yes, I totally agree. We have witnessed that the coastline of eastern Kamchatka was covered by dead sea animals that were brought from the sea, from the water. And also people, after contact with water in the middle of September, they had some serious health issues. And we are still now we get some new information that there is some other consequences that we could notice on the western coast. So also that animals were found on the shore. And according to the local scientists who investigated a little bit the seabed in Avacha Bay, divers went down to the seabed into the water, and they found that according to their statements, 95% of local marine life is dead. So I think that this could be already described as environmental catastrophe.
Once again, if you're just tuning in, I'm Eli Finkelson. You're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes, and we're speaking right now with Dr. Elena Sakirko from Greenpeace Russia. My next question for you is that some Russian officials and scientists have said that it is blooming algae that is the reason that these marine animals, as you mentioned, washed up on the shore dead. Do you believe that it's blooming algae? Do you believe that it was human error and pollution that caused this mass die-off? Can you talk to us about why you think this happened, at least in this beginning stage?
Well, at the moment, one of our missions there is also to get as much information from the ground as possible, and to check all possible versions of the source of this environmental catastrophe by taking the samples of the ground, of the water, of these dead sea animals, of so-called biomaterial, to take it to the testing facilities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And we are checking all the possible versions. At the moment, we do not have confirmations that this is algae blooming, or this is not algae blooming. So we are at the moment, we cannot either confirm or say that it's not this. But I should just mention that according to some scientists who dealt with these issues, like red tides, according to their statements, regions where it happens, they are normally have very polluted water, so some issues with pollutions in the sea. So we think that if this is the algae blooming, then the other question that we should try to answer is what have caused this blooming. It might have been like both factors, contamination, pollution, and algae blooming because of that, or some other factor. It could also be connected with a higher temperature of the water, according to some climate scientists.
Well, that brings me to my next question for you, which is more general about climate change itself. Can you tell me about some of the things that you're seeing either in Russia or around the world that are clear causes, or effects of climate change in our oceans right now?
There are a lot of issues that are connected. Well, oceans are connected with this issue a lot. The temperature of the oceans is rising. The sea level is rising, and so some coastlines are being flooded, and also there is like such an issue as acidification of the oceans, and plastic pollution in the oceans, and some dead areas in the oceans caused by these pollutions, and all this together also this acidification can also provoke a rise of the temperature, according to some scientists, from half degree to 1 degree even.
So if things continue on as they have with the pollution you're talking about, rising sea level, rising temperatures, what do you think that our sort of societies will start to look like 5, 20, even 100 years from now if we continue on the same path with climate change?
At the moment, in the whole world, we can see that people leave their houses because they cannot continue, for example, the traditional lifestyle because of some floods or because of some dry periods, because of some fires. And now in Russia, we can also observe this situation in some northern remote parts of Russia already, like Yakutia. Already many people suffer from flooding every year, and the year which they have no floods is some like special, really special year for them. So some villages are already having it like a daily problem. Some infrastructure in the north is also in danger because of melting permafrost, and we have like around 60% of Russia is covered by permafrost, so it's also a very big issue. And I should say that this could be connected with big social problems as well, because it could lead to some people migrations, to some economic problems, and we in Greenpeace at the moment developed green recovery package for Russia together with some experts, which has some concrete suggestions for every sector of economics, and that we have to restructure our economics, like our way of dealing business in such a way that it will be climate friendly. So, I mean, we have to change our waste management system, our forest management system, our energy policy, switch to renewables, and use more ecological transport technologies, like get away from fossil fuels and do not use such technologies that could lead to very dangerous issues in the future, and try to prevent environmental catastrophes, and not just to react to them when they happen, but be really introduce some systemic change that could also prevent us from getting into a deep economic crisis.
Once again, if you're just tuning in, this is Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, joined right now by Dr. Elena Sakirko from Greenpeace Russia. One of my final questions for you is just, can you compare Russia and the United States when it comes to the ways that we're dealing with climate change, the ways that, as you just mentioned, waste management, fossil fuels? Can you just compare what you see in Russia versus what you see in the United States with how the two countries are dealing with climate change differently?
It's a difficult question for me. I like working more with issues in the country, but I should say that in the whole world, people do not trust enough. Do not deal enough serious with climate issues, and especially those who take decisions, like the government. And I see some similar situations also in Russia and the United States, that people that already face some social and environmental issues provoked by climate change, they need to demand some changes from the government, and some systemic change, because it's about their life, it's about their health, it's about their ability to have future.
Do you think that there's anything else that's important to add when we're speaking about either climate change in our oceans, or the mass die-off we just saw in Kamchatka, or the different things that you're seeing about the ways that Russia is combating climate change? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would like to add that I hope that such situations will really change the situation as well, because on Kamchatka we are seeing now how people around the whole country are there is like a wave of solidarity, and people are trying to support those who are in Kamchatka. They are also demanding very transparent investigation on what has happened, and we see also government reacting to this, and that this public demand works, and that I hope that we together can change the situation and switch to more climate-friendly technologies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elena Sakirko, for joining us today. I know it's actually evening where you are, so I really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to speak with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next, for Around the World in 30 Minutes, I spoke with Dr. Emily Pidgeon, Vice President of Ocean Science at Conservation International. An Australian native, Dr. Pidgeon explained the dying off of the coral reefs off the coast of her home country and the impact climate change's effects on our oceans could have on the global economy and human life. Dr. Pidgeon, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Absolutely. So to just get started, can you tell us a little bit about Conservation International, its mission, what you guys do?
So we are an international organization committed to bringing nature-based solutions to communities and countries around the world to really address the issues facing the world with solutions based on conserving and restoring nature.
Then you are definitely the perfect person to be talking to right now about climate change when it comes to our oceans all around the world. So let's talk about general climate change for a minute and its effect on our oceans. What effects are you seeing right now around the world that climate change is having on oceans?
I think that most people don't understand or don't know that climate change is probably impacting the oceans more than it's affecting our atmosphere. And we all feel the impacts of climate change. I live in California, where we're feeling that it's a very unusually warm day here today. But really, 90% of the heat that has come from climate change is being absorbed by our oceans. And over a third of the carbon dioxide that is the greenhouse gas that's causing climate change is actually being absorbed by the oceans. And that doesn't just happen magically and have no impact. That warming of the oceans and that increase of carbon dioxide in the oceans is having major effects on life in the oceans and on people that depend upon that life. So for instance, we are seeing coral reefs around the world die. There was an announcement just this week that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, where I'm from, is now lost half of its coral cover. And we're also seeing many species move, because as oceans warm, they want to maintain their temperature. And so fisheries that many communities depend upon are moving towards the poles to maintain the temperatures that they're used to.
And how does that affect ocean ecosystems when species just up and leave like that?
So it tears the fabric of the ecosystems apart. Some species are increasing as they move north. They're invading some ecosystems. We're seeing this along the coasts of North America. And then clearly in the tropical areas, where we have many populations that depend on fisheries, on small-scale fish around them to feed their families and provide a livelihood, those ecosystems are becoming dominated by other species. Here on the coast in California, where I live, we are seeing outbreaks of species that eat the kelp forest, and the kelp forest, which has been the sort of basic forest that lives along the coast here, is dying off because of the ocean warming that we're seeing that's already happening.
And for those of you just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, and we're joined right now with Dr. Emily Pidgeon, Vice President of Ocean Science for Conservation International. So the things that we're talking about right now, right? Species moving from place to place, ecosystems being torn apart, and it having a dramatic effect on societies, which we'll get to in a minute. But let's talk about what that effect does 10, 20, even 100 years down the line. What does it look like for the oceans and for people if we continue on the same path of climate change that we're on right now?
Well, the ocean is already changing and will be fundamentally different in even 20, 50 years if we continue on in the path that we're going on right now. I think extreme sea level events, such as surges from tropical cyclones that are currently historically rare, will become commonplace by 2100. Sea levels are rising as a result of the heat that is going into the oceans and causing that water to expand. And we're going to see large flooding on coasts as a result of climate change if it continues as it does right now. And I think that many of the species that we take for granted will disappear. Coral reefs, many scientists are concerned that coral reefs will functionally disappear in the next 20 to 30 years.
So let's talk about coral reefs for a minute, because I feel like that's the first thing that everybody thinks about when they think about climate change in the ocean is what's happening with the coral reefs. What do coral reefs do for marine life, for life in general on Earth? What is the function of a coral reef, and why is it so important that they stay healthy and well?
So coral reefs are some of the most biodiverse places on Earth. And we think of the fish and maybe the corals, but there's a whole amazing diversity of life that lives on a coral reef. And so I think in some ways, just knowing that coral reefs exist and that biodiversity exists and is threatened is in itself a reason for being concerned. However, for quite literally billions of people who live in tropical areas in many of the countries in the Pacific and throughout the oceans, coral reefs provide income and livelihoods that feed their families and provide their subsistence income. And so those reefs are critical as resources for food and for other important resources that we depend upon. Those coral reefs are also the first line of protection that many island nations around the world have from storms. Those reefs act as a barrier between communities on the beach or on the coast and the waves that come in generated by storms. And so as we lose those coral reefs, many communities in island nations are becoming more and more exposed to the increasing storms that we're seeing.
And I can only imagine how dangerous that is for them. But you also mentioned the economies of these smaller nations that really rely on fishing and trade when it comes to marine life and food sources. Can you tell us a little bit about how the effects that we just mentioned about how the oceans will be permanently changed even 20, 50 years from now? What effect is that going to have on the economies of those smaller nations or even bigger nations that rely on the ocean for survival?
Definitely. So the coastal zone around the world is home to about over 600 million people. That's over 10% of the global population. And it's projected to be almost 1 billion people by 2050. So all of those communities, the ones with coral reefs, but even those of us that live in higher latitudes that don't have coral reefs, are going to be impacted by sea level rise, which will increase erosion and really threaten infrastructure and those of us that live on the coasts. But then, as you say, it's also going to affect all of the industries that depend on resources from the oceans along the coast. And that includes fisheries, coral reef-based fisheries, but also fisheries that depend on species here in California, the salmon fishery, and the rockfish fishery will be and are already being severely impacted by species moving and not being as close to port as they once were.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that up to 1 billion people could be affected by the change of our ocean because of climate change in the next 20 to 50 years. That's correct?
Exactly. Yes.
That's so interesting, because I feel like people never think about it in terms of how many people this really affects all across the world. So let's discuss some of the ways that we could potentially mitigate those disasters and help the 1 billion people that could be affected by this. So you're working with Conservation International on ways to potentially mitigate the effects of climate change. And one thing that I read about you is that you're working on something called blue carbon. Can you explain what blue carbon is and how it could potentially mitigate these effects?
Yeah, so obviously the most important thing for the oceans at the moment is to reduce emissions and to really address the problem of climate change on a big scale. And that involves many different important approaches that we are looking at, changing energy, changing transportation, changing how we produce things every day. But I think that one of the things we're learning is that there are coastal ecosystems that are also an important part of this set of solutions for addressing climate change. And those that we've been thinking about first are some of these coastal wetland systems, and they include mangrove systems, which are amazing forests that actually live in the water in tropical areas. And it also includes salt marshes, which there's lots of beautiful salt marsh along the coast here in California where I live, but in many other areas of the world, but then also seagrasses. And it turns out that these ecosystems sequester or remove carbon dioxide from both the air and the water, and then bury it in the soil below them and lock it away for millennia. And so these ecosystems are even more efficient at doing this, or more effective at doing this, than many of the forests that we hear about, like the Amazon.
Once again, if you're just tuning in, this is Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. We're joined right now by Dr. Emily Pidgeon, Vice President of Ocean Science for Conservation International. So my next question for you, Dr. Pidgeon, is just what can your average person be doing right now to try and help combat climate change?
So I think many of us are aware of the important things we should be doing to reduce our impacts. That includes reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by reducing our electricity use, by reducing the amount we drive, and reducing our travel, which I guess many of us have been doing recently anyway. But I think one thing that's really important is to get in touch with some of these other solutions that we don't think of. So if we're thinking about blue carbon, like we discussed, to really begin to understand how important these ecosystems are to you and to the people around you every day. We sort of take them for granted. Those of us that live in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's wonderful wetlands that exist all around the bay. And I think we all drive past them and don't understand how critical they are to being our solution to climate change. So really getting out and really learning about the ecosystems that surround you every day, and understanding how important they are as a solution to climate change.
And for people that don't live on coasts, right, people that are not a part of that 1 billion, why should they care? What should motivate them to do these things?
So, I mean, there's other important ecosystems. If you're in the middle of the country, the prairie lands and the forests are also very important stores of carbon. And I think learning more about those ecosystems and how they have a role that we don't all fully understand or appreciate in addressing climate change. A lot of the agricultural lands, if it managed appropriately, can be an important solution for climate change. But I think that climate change is something that affects all of us every day. And I think we're all beginning to learn and see those impacts, whether it be through the hurricanes hitting the east coast of the US more frequently, the abnormally warm climates that we're feeling here on the west coast of the US, and other impacts. Climate change is something that affects all of us. And while the actions that are relevant or performed on the coasts, whether it be saving blue carbon systems to address climate change or changing how much we fly, these are actions that all of us can do to really help our community and help everyone worldwide reduce the impacts of climate change on us all.
Is there anything else that you feel is important to add when we're discussing climate change, how it affects our oceans, the ecosystems it affects, the people it affects? Is there anything else that you want to add when it comes to climate change in our waters?
I think one of the key things that we're just learning right now is that the oceans are actually pretty critical to the discussions of climate change, and they haven't been central in the same way that they need to be. I think that the oceans are what drives climate change, that the warming of the oceans, this idea that the oceans have absorbed 90% of the extra heat from climate change, that those warming oceans is what's causing the more frequent hurricanes that we see in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so I think that we need to really be thinking more about the oceans as a key factor when we think about the climate that we feel, even if it's in the middle of the country. You're connected to the oceans wherever you are in the US because those oceans are bringing you your weather every day.
And I think one of the most up and coming things that we talk about when combating climate change is hydrotechnology, right? The idea that water could be powering so many things if we were using it. Can you talk a little bit about hydrotechnology and the potential behind that?
So most hydrotechnology involves controlling dams and controlling water. At the moment is associated with dams and technology associated with freshwater systems on land. And that, while it has huge potential, has also a number of significant environmental impacts that we need to sort of think through. China, for instance, is dramatically expanding its hydropower in the coming years, which, while it reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, has potentially vast environmental impacts on the ecosystems downstream of those dams. And so there's sort of complexities to that. There are other forms of ocean-based energy, though, that we should be thinking about. And those include tidal power, wave power, and these are emerging technologies, which, again, there's complexities associated with them, but they may well provide sustainable long-term solutions for energy that we will be seeing expanding over the coming decades.
And my last question for you is just, is there one thing that you would point to people that say that climate change does not exist?
One thing that I would point to is that I think that given the overwhelming evidence that we're feeling, here in California, the expanding fires that we're seeing, the largest fire regime that's ever been experienced in my home country of Australia. Last year, we similarly saw expanding fires. I think that anybody who really does not believe in climate change at the moment, I find it difficult to, if that evidence isn't sufficient for you, I would ask, what's the harm in doing better? I think that this idea that all of the actions that we're seeing related to climate change are now being seen as very important for the economy, providing significant economic stimulus as we move to these alternative power sources and conserve these ecosystems. And so to me, there's no real argument against doing any of this work. Not only is it good for the climate and essential for the climate, but I think it's has positives on all other fronts as well. So to me, even if you're not doing this work for the climate purpose, there are many reasons to do it for the benefit of the community anyway.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emily Pidgeon, Vice President of Ocean Science at Conservatio International, for being with us today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And that'll do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank you to reporter Connor Donnelly and producer Cassidy Slammin. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you might think.